What if the most famous surgery in history never actually happened? What if Eve wasn't born from Adam's rib, but from something far more sophisticated than we've ever imagined? For 2,000 years, we've been told a story of divine romance. God puts Adam to sleep, takes a rib, fashions a woman, and love is born. It's beautiful, it's poetic, and it's become the foundation of how we understand human relationships and creation itself. But what if that's not what the Hebrew text actually says? Genesis 2:21 in Hebrew reads, Vayapel Elohim tardama al ha'adam vayishan vayikach achat mitzalotav. Every translation you've ever read renders this as rib. The King James Version says rib. The New International Version says rib. The Catholic Douay Rhymes says rib. But here's the problem. The Hebrew word isn't rib at all. The word is tsela. And tsela has never meant rib in any other biblical context. When you examine every other occurrence of this word throughout the Hebrew Bible, tsela consistently refers to structural elements, architectural components, and building materials. In Exodus, when describing the construction of the ark, tsela refers to the sides of the structure. In the detailed blueprints of Solomon's temple, tsela describes the chambers and supporting sections. When the tabernacle is constructed, tsela indicates the lateral components and supporting beams. Never in any other biblical passage does tsela refer to a single bone extracted from a living creature. This isn't a minor translation issue. This completely changes what we think happened in that primordial operating theater. When Genesis says God took achat mitzalotav, it's not saying one of his ribs. The text is describing the extraction of one of his structural components, one half of his genetic architecture, one side of his biological framework. This isn't poetry describing divine romance. This is medical precision documented 3,000 years before we had the vocabulary to understand what was actually being described. But let's examine the surrounding terminology to fully grasp what's being documented here. The Hebrew word tardama, which every translation renders as deep sleep, appears only 7 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. And in each instance, it describes something far more intense than natural sleep. When Abraham receives his covenant in Genesis 15, tardama is accompanied by dread and great darkness. When Saul's entire army falls unconscious in 1 Samuel, it's described as a supernatural tardama that renders them completely unaware of their surroundings. This isn't rest or peaceful slumber. This is induced unconsciousness, medical anesthesia, administered by beings with advanced knowledge of human physiology. Now, picture this scene as it actually unfolds, not in a garden of flowers and singing birds, but in a controlled environment, a sterile facility where advanced beings we call the Elohim approach their unconscious subject. The next phrase in Hebrew is Vayikach achat mitzalotav vayizgor basar tachtena. Standard translations read, He took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh. But the actual meaning is far more precise. He extracted one structural component and sealed the biological material. The word basar doesn't simply mean flesh in the way we understand it. In Hebrew, basar refers to living tissue, genetic material, what modern science would call DNA. And vayizgor doesn't mean closed up in a casual sense. It means sealed, contained, preserved with the same precision used when God seals Noah into the ark, or when ancient texts describe the preservation of sacred objects. What we're reading is a description of surgical extraction and genetic preservation, documented with clinical accuracy by people who wouldn't have the scientific vocabulary to fully comprehend what they were witnessing. But the most revealing word comes next, vayavan. When describing what the Elohim did with the extracted genetic material, the Hebrew text uses vayavan, which means constructed, built, or engineered. This is the same verb used for building cities, assembling structures, and manufacturing objects. Eve wasn't formed or created in the traditional sense. She was constructed from extracted genetic architecture in what can only be described as an advanced cloning procedure. When Adam first encounters this constructed being, his response has been romanticized for millennia. But the Hebrew reveals something entirely different. Vayomer ha'adam zot hapa'am etzem me'atzmai uvasar mivsari. The Standard Translation reads, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." But etzem doesn't simply mean bone. Throughout Hebrew scripture, etzem refers to essence, core structure, fundamental substance. Adam isn't making a poetic statement about shared bones. He's recognizing shared genetic code, essential structure, biological compatibility. And notice the word hapa'am, which translators render as now or this time. But hapa'am literally means this occurrence, this instance, this iteration. Adam is recognizing Eve as another version of himself, a successful iteration, which implies there were previous attempts, failed iterations, discarded prototypes that didn't meet the specifications. This interpretation isn't speculative. It aligns perfectly with Sumerian accounts written 1,000 years before Genesis. The Enuma Elish and the Epic of Atrahasis describe the Anunnaki gods engaging in systematic biological production, using what they call titu, not clay or dirt, but living material, biological substrate, base genetic material. These texts document extraction of genetic essence, combination with existing biological templates, incubation in artificial wombs, and 14 birth goddesses serving as surrogate carriers. The Akkadian Epic of Atrahasis provides clinical details. Nintu shall pinch off 14 pieces of titu. 7 she shall place on the right, 7 on the left. Between them she shall place the libitum. The libitum, translated as brick, refers to a mold or template, what modern geneticists would recognize as a DNA scaffold. This isn't pottery or primitive craftsmanship. This is systematic biological production, mass cloning using artificial gestation chambers. When you examine the Hebrew terminology for Adam's creation versus Eve's construction, the distinction becomes even more revealing. Adam's formation uses yatsar, meaning to mold or shape from raw material, but Eve's creation uses banah, meaning to build or engineer from existing components. Two different processes, two different methodologies. Adam was the prototype formed from base material. Eve was the improved model engineered from existing genetic architecture. This progression suggests refinement in their techniques, advancement in their methods, and it explains why immediately after Eve's construction, Adam prophesies about future human relationships. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Why would seeing a woman constructed from his genetic material inspire prophecy about all future marriages unless he understood something profound about genetic compatibility, biological pairing, and the need for humans to find their genetic counterpart? The phrase one flesh in Hebrew is basar echad, which doesn't describe emotional unity, but genetic recombination, the restoration of original genetic architecture through reproduction. Eve wasn't Adam's romantic companion. She was his genetic twin, his perfect biological match, created not for love, but for reproduction, for the continuation of a carefully planned genetic experiment. Consider the implications. If Eve was cloned from Adam's genetic material, then every human being descends from a single genetic source. We're not the product of natural evolution, but the result of directed engineering by beings with capabilities that surpass our current understanding. The Sumerian tablets explicitly state that the Anunnaki needed workers, beings intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, but not intelligent enough to challenge their creators, genetically programmed for compliance. Eve wasn't Adam's gift from benevolent creators. She was the second prototype, the reproductive module, the mechanism by which the genetic experiment would continue and expand. This explains why the Elohim's first command to the newly created pair isn't a blessing, but an order. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. The Hebrew verb kabash, translated as subdue, means to bring under control, to dominate, to manage as property. They weren't being given dominion over the earth. They were being assigned management roles as caretakers of a planet-sized facility. This interpretation explains the obsession with genealogies throughout Genesis. Not family pride, but quality control, genetic tracking, monitoring the success of the breeding program. It explains why the Elohim later regretted their creation, not because humans were evil, but because they were evolving beyond their programming, developing independence, questioning their creators. The flood wasn't divine judgment, but a systematic reset, elimination of genetically corrupted specimens, with Noah's family preserved as backup copies. But here's the most disturbing possibility of all. If Eve was cloned from Adam, and Adam was created by the Elohim, then Adam wasn't the first human. He was the first successful prototype, the genetic template, the source code for the human species. The Hebrew word Adamah, traditionally translated as from the ground, shares its linguistic structure with words meaning to be like or to resemble. Adam wasn't made from earth. He was made to resemble something else. The Sumerian equivalent, Adamu, doesn't mean earthling, but first settlement. Not the first human, but the first successful colony. Which means somewhere in our past, there were failed experiments, discarded prototypes, earlier versions that didn't meet specifications. The mysterious Nephilim mentioned in Genesis weren't angels breeding with humans, but genetic experiments gone wrong, corrupted prototypes, failed iterations that survived the initial culling and were contaminating the genetic program by breeding with the successful models, forcing the Elohim to initiate a planetary reset. Adam and Eve weren't individuals, but product lines, foundation models for human civilization, created by beings whose agenda we're only beginning to understand. And if that's true, then every human alive today carries the genetic signature of that original intervention. We're not just Homo sapiens. We're Homo sapiens 2.0, upgraded, modified, engineered by beings we called gods, but who were actually scientists conducting the most sophisticated genetic engineering project in recorded history. The question isn't whether we evolved. The question is whether we evolved naturally or if we're the product of directed intervention by beings whose technology we're only now beginning to comprehend. Next episode, we'll examine the most troubling possibility of all. If Adam was a prototype, then what happened to the original humans who were here before the genetic intervention? And why does the Bible hint that they might still be among us, hidden in plain sight. If you've ever wondered why human DNA contains so many anomalies that evolutionary biologists can't explain, drop a comment below. Because if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about human origins, we're just getting started. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, and at the bottom, you might not like what you find.